The blade was already at her throat when Ilara Voss opened her eyes. Cold steel pressed against warm skin, and the forest around her spun with smoke and torchlight. Somewhere behind her, wolves were howling, not the wild kind, but the trained kind, the kind that answered to a king. Her hands were bound, her knees dug into wet earth. And the man holding the blade was not looking at her face. He was staring at the side of her neck like he had found something he did not want to find. "Don't move," he said quietly, and the voice did not match the danger of the moment. It was low, controlled, almost gentle, the voice of someone used to being obeyed without needing to raise it. Ilara did not move. She had learned long ago that stillness kept people alive. Around them, the clearing was full of chaos. Her clan, the last free rogues of the northern woods, had been ambushed at the border an hour before dawn. Half of them were already on their knees with weapons at their backs. The other half had scattered into the trees, chased by soldiers wearing the crest of the Ashworth crown, a silver wolf howling beneath a broken moon. Ilara had tried to run too, until this man had caught her by the wrist and thrown her to the ground like she weighed nothing at all. Now he crouched in front of her, blade steady, eyes narrowed, and she finally saw his face clearly in the firelight. He was young for a king, sharp-jawed, with eyes the color of storm clouds, and a stillness about him that felt more dangerous than any sword. She had heard stories about Chaol Ashworth since she was a child. The Alpha King who took the throne at 22 after his father's reign, ended in ruin. The king who never touched a mate, never married, never let anyone close enough to matter. Some called him cold, others called him wise. Nobody called him kind. He leaned in slightly, and Ilara watched something shift behind his eyes, a flicker of surprise, almost alarm, as if he had touched fire and not expected the burn. He pulled back so fast it looked like she had struck him. "Captain," he said, standing abruptly and turning his back to her, "bring the rogue leader to me, now." A soldier rushed forward, dragging a woman with silver-streaked hair and blood on her lip, Mira Thorne, the leader of Ilara's clan, and the closest thing to a mother Ilara had left. Mira's eyes found Ilara instantly, checking her, and Ilara gave the smallest nod to say she was unharmed. "Your people crossed into my territory without permission," Chaol said, his voice carrying easily across the clearing, cutting through the noise until even the wolves seemed to quiet. "That is an act of war under the old treaties." "We crossed because we were starving," Mira said, chin lifted despite the blood on her face. "Because the Eastern Pax burned our hunting grounds and left us nothing. We came here because we heard the Ashworth Kingdom does not turn away the desperate." Something moved behind Chaol's eyes again. Ilara, still kneeling, still bound, watched him carefully, the way she watched wounded animals, before deciding whether they would bite or let themselves be healed. He was doing calculations, weighing something. His soldiers waited for the order that would decide whether this clearing became a grave or a gate. "Release them," Chaol said finally. A murmur ran through his soldiers, but no one questioned it aloud. Nobody questioned Chaol Ashworth. Not since the day he had taken the throne from a father who nearly destroyed it. The ropes were cut. Ilara rubbed her wrists and rose slowly, watching the king who had almost cut her throat, and then changed his mind in the space of a single breath. He was not looking at her now. He was very carefully not looking at her, and that, more than anything, made her want to understand why. "Your people may shelter within my borders until the Eastern conflict is resolved," Chaol announced, addressing Mira, but his eyes flicking, just once, back to Ilara, before catching himself. "You will be housed near the southern wall. You will not enter the palace grounds. You will not approach the royal court. Is that understood?" "Understood," Mira said, though her eyes narrowed slightly, sensing something unspoken beneath the king's words. As the soldiers began organizing the rogue clan for the march toward the palace lands, Ilara found herself walking past Chaol, close enough to feel the heat radiating from him despite the cold morning air. He stiffened as she passed. She noticed. She was a healer. She noticed everything about bodies, the way they moved, the way they betrayed what words tried to hide. His jaw was tight. His hands, at his sides, had curled into fists. "Your Grace," she said, testing something she could not name. "Thank you for sparing my people." He turned to look at her fully for the first time since that first startled glance, and for a moment, just a moment, Something raw and unguarded passed across his face before the mask of the king slid back into place. "Do not thank me," he said quietly. "Just stay away from the palace." Then he turned and walked into the trees, calling orders to his soldiers, leaving Alara standing in the ruined clearing, with a strange, unfamiliar warmth spreading through her chest, like she had stood too close to a fire she did not remember lighting. She did not understand it yet. She would not understand it for weeks. But something had shifted in that clearing, something old and powerful and completely outside her control, and no matter how far the king tried to keep her from his palace walls, the thread between them had already been tied. The journey to the southern wall took most of the day. Alara walked beside Mira, tending to the wounded among their people, with what little supplies she had managed to keep hidden in her satchel during the chaos of the ambush. A young boy named Rowan had a gash along his arm that needed stitching. An older man, Callum, had twisted his ankle badly enough that he needed a crutch fashioned from a broken spear. Alara worked quickly, efficiently, the way she always did, losing herself in the rhythm of care, because it was easier than thinking about the strange heat still lingering in her chest. "You felt something back there," Mira said quietly, walking beside her as Alara finished bandaging Rowan's arm. "I saw your face when the king looked at you." "I felt fear," Alara said. "He had a blade at my throat." "That is not the face of fear I saw." Mira's voice was gentle but knowing, the voice of a woman who had lived long enough to recognize things before they were spoken aloud. "Be careful, child. Kings do not fall easily, and when they do, everyone around them falls too." Alara said nothing, because she did not have an answer that made sense even to herself. By evening, they reached the southern wall, a long stretch of stone bordering the outer edge of the Ashworth kingdom, dotted with modest wooden houses meant for traveling merchants and border guards. It was far from luxurious, but it was warm, and it was safe, and after weeks of running from burned villages and hungry nights, safety felt like more than enough. Alara was given a small room at the end of a narrow hall, barely large enough for a cot and a wash basin, but she did not complain. She had slept in far worse places. She set her satchel of herbs and bandages on the small wooden table and sat on the edge of the cot, finally allowing herself a moment of stillness after a day that had nearly ended in her death. That was when she felt it. A pull, faint but unmistakable, like a string tied gently around her ribs and tugged from somewhere far away. She pressed a hand to her chest, frowning, trying to understand the sensation. It was not pain. It was not fear. It was something closer to longing, an ache for something she could not name, pulling her attention toward the north, toward the palace she had been told never to approach. She told herself it was exhaustion. She told herself it was the stress of the ambush, the fear of nearly losing her throat to a king's blade, the grief of watching her people lose yet another home before finding this fragile new one. She told herself many things that night, lying awake on the narrow cot, staring at the wooden ceiling above her. But none of those explanations stopped the pull. Miles away, within the stone walls of the Ashworth Palace, Cale Ashworth stood at the window of his private chamber, staring out at the dark line of trees separating the palace grounds from the southern wall. His hands gripped the stone windowsill hard enough that his knuckles had gone white. He had smelled her the moment he crouched in front of her in that clearing. Wildflowers and rain, a scent so specific, so undeniable, that his wolf had nearly clawed its way to the surface, right there in front of his own soldiers. He had recognized it instantly for what it was, the thing every alpha both hoped for and feared in equal measure. A mate. Fate had chosen a rogue healer from a starving clan to be the other half of his soul, and Cale Ashworth wanted nothing to do with it. He remembered his father too clearly, remembered the way King Aldrich Ashworth had once been a strong and steady ruler, before he found his mate and lost himself entirely in the bond. Cale remembered years of a kingdom left to rot while his father chased his mate's every mood, ignored his counsel, ignored his duties, ignored his own son, until the bond that was supposed to be a blessing became the very thing that nearly tore their kingdom apart. Cale remembered standing in a war room at 16 years old, watching his father weep over a woman instead of leading his people, and he remembered swearing, right there, that he would never let a bond control him the way it had controlled his father. He had made that vow publicly the night he took the throne. The entire court had heard it. Should the goddess ever curse him with a mate, he would not touch her. He would not claim her. He would rule with his mind, not his instincts, and his kingdom would never again be held hostage by a bond neither party had chosen. He had believed, foolishly, that the vow would be easy to keep if the day never came. Now the day had come, wrapped in a healer's steady hands and a scent that made his wolf howl with a hunger he had never felt before, and Cale understood, standing at that window with his jaw clenched so tight it ached, that keeping his vow was about to become the hardest thing he had ever done. He turned from the window and summoned his second-in-command, a broad-shouldered soldier named Finn Bracken, who had served him since childhood and knew him well enough to read the tension in his shoulders without needing to ask. The rogue clan settled at the southern wall, Cale said, his voice carefully flat. There is a healer among them, Alara Voss. See that she is kept far from the palace grounds. Assign her to any post that keeps her occupied and distant. I do not want her near the court. Finn studied him for a long moment, the way old friends do when they sense something is being left unsaid. Any particular reason, Your Grace? No, Cale said, too quickly. Just see it done. Finn did not push further, though the slight lift of his eyebrow made it clear he did not entirely believe the answer. He bowed and left to carry out the order, and Cale was left alone again in his chamber, staring at his own reflection in the dark window glass, trying and failing to convince himself that distance would be enough. It would not be enough. Some part of him, the ancient wolf buried beneath centuries of careful control, already knew that. Distance had never stopped a bond from growing. It had only ever delayed the inevitable, and delay, Cale was about to learn, came with its own dangerous cost. Days passed at the southern wall, in quiet, steady rhythm. Alara busied herself tending to her people, treating minor injuries, teaching the children which plants could heal and which could harm, trying to build something like normal life out of the wreckage of everything they had lost. She did not see the king again. She told herself that was for the best. But every night, lying on her narrow cot, she felt that same quiet pull toward the north, toward the palace she had been forbidden to approach, and every night it grew a little stronger, a little harder to ignore, until Alara began to wonder if some invisible thread truly did stretch between her heart and the cold, controlled king, who had spared her life and then vanished from it entirely. She did not know yet that the same thread was pulling at him too, tightening a little more each day, no matter how hard he tried to sever it with duty, distance, and a vow he was determined never to break. Neither of them knew, not yet, that fate rarely honored vows made out of fear. And somewhere between the southern wall and the palace towers, something patient and inevitable was already beginning to move, drawing two unwilling hearts closer together with every quiet, aching day that passed. The summons came on a morning thick with fog, delivered by a palace guard, who looked uneasy the entire time he spoke. The healer Alara Voss is required at the palace infirmary immediately, he said, his eyes darting toward Mira as though expecting resistance. There is an outbreak among the guard. Moonrot fever. The palace healers are overwhelmed. Alara was already reaching for her satchel before he finished speaking. Moonrot fever was rare but vicious, a sickness that struck wolves during their shift between forms, burning through the body with a fever that could kill within 3 days if not treated with the right combination of silverleaf and cooling herbs. She had trained under an old healer who survived an outbreak decades ago and had passed down every remedy she knew. I told them to keep her away from the palace, Mira muttered, frowning at the guard. The order came from the king himself, the guard said, looking almost apologetic. He said to bring her by name. Alara felt the pull in her chest sharpen instantly, like a string drawn taut, and she did not have time to wonder what it meant before she was walking briskly toward the palace gates, her satchel slung over her shoulder, her heart beating faster than the pace of her steps could explain. The infirmary was chaos when she arrived. Soldiers lay in rows across narrow cots, sweating through fevers that made their bodies shudder between human and wolf forms uncontrollably. The palace healers, exhausted and outnumbered, moved between patients with growing desperation. Alara did not waste time introducing herself. She dropped to her knees beside the nearest cot, checked the soldier's pulse, examined his eyes, and began calling out instructions. Silverleaf tea, steeped for no longer than 4 minutes, or it turns bitter and useless. Cool cloths on the wrists and throat, not the forehead. The fever burns hottest where the pulse runs closest to the skin. Keep them still. Do not let them shift. Shifting during moon rot burns through what strength they have left. The palace healers exchanged uncertain glances, unused to taking direction from a rogue outsider, but the fear in the room was strong enough to override pride. Within minutes, Elara had organized the infirmary into something resembling order, moving from cot to cot with quick, sure hands, her voice steady even as the room filled with the groans of suffering men. She did not notice Cale standing in the doorway until she looked up and found him watching her. He looked different here than he had in the clearing, less armored, more exposed, his eyes shadowed with worry that had nothing to do with kingdoms or duty. She followed his gaze to the cot nearest the far wall, where a broad-shouldered man lay shivering violently, sweat soaking through his shirt. Finn Bracken, his second in command, his closest friend since childhood. He is your strongest fighter, Cale said quietly, crossing the room to stand beside her. Save him. I intend to save all of them, Elara said, not looking up from the soldier she was tending. Your Grace, if you truly want to help, boil water and keep it boiling. I will need a steady supply for the next 3 days. For a moment, Cale simply stared at her, unused to being given instructions by anyone, let alone a rogue healer half his rank in the eyes of the court. Then, to the visible shock of the palace healers watching, the Alpha King of Ashworth rolled up his sleeves and went to find a kettle. The next 3 days blurred together in a haze of fevered bodies, boiling water, and steeped silver leaf. Elara barely slept, moving from cot to cot with a determination that left no room for exhaustion, and Cale, against every instinct of duty that told him to return to his council chamber, found himself returning to the infirmary again and again. He told himself it was for Finn. He told himself it was his responsibility as king to be present when his soldiers suffered. He told himself many things over those 3 days, and every single one of them was a lie he almost believed. The truth was simpler and far more dangerous. He could not stay away from her. He watched the way she pressed cool cloths to fevered wrists with a gentleness that never once wavered, even in her exhaustion. He watched the way she spoke softly to frightened young soldiers who did not understand why their bodies were betraying them, calming them, with a steadiness that felt like warmth spreading through the entire room. He watched her hands, quick and sure, and found himself wondering what it would feel like to have those same hands rest against his own skin without the excuse of illness between them. On the second night, exhausted and unable to sleep, he found her sitting alone in the infirmary courtyard, staring up at a sky thick with clouds, her knees pulled to her chest. You should rest, he said, settling onto the stone bench beside her, close enough that he could feel the warmth radiating from her skin. So should you, she replied without looking at him. Kings need sleep too, I imagine. Apparently rogue healers do not. A small, tired smile touched her lips, the first he had seen from her, and something in his chest tightened painfully at the sight of it. My people taught me that rest comes after the work is done, not before, she said. We never had the luxury of stopping halfway. Cale was quiet for a moment, watching her profile in the dim light spilling from the infirmary windows. Your people are lucky to have you. Are you always this generous with rogues, Your Grace, or am I a special case? The question landed closer to the truth than she realized, and Cale felt his jaw tighten as he searched for an answer that would not reveal too much. You saved my closest friend's life, he said finally. That earns more than generosity. Elara turned to look at him then, studying his face with the same careful attention she gave her patients, searching for something hidden beneath the surface. You keep looking at me like you are trying to solve a puzzle you already know the answer to but refuse to say out loud. Cale's breath caught. For one dangerous moment, the truth sat right at the edge of his tongue, the word mate pressing against his teeth, desperate to be spoken. He thought of his father, weeping over a woman while his kingdom crumbled around him, and he swallowed the truth back down before it could escape. You are imagining things, he said, standing abruptly. Get some rest, Elara. Your patients will need you again by morning. He left before she could respond, walking quickly through the dark corridors toward his own chamber, his heart pounding in a way that had nothing to do with fear, and everything to do with a truth he refused to let himself speak aloud. Behind him, Elara sat alone in the courtyard for a long while, staring at the door he had disappeared through, that same familiar pull tightening in her chest, stronger now than it had ever been, until it felt less like a mystery and more like an answer waiting just out of reach. By the third morning, Finn's fever broke. His color returned, his shaking stilled, and when he finally opened his eyes and asked for water in a hoarse but steady voice, the entire infirmary seemed to breathe a collective sigh of relief. One by one, the other soldiers followed, their fevers cooling, their strength slowly returning under Alara's relentless care. Cale found her afterward, standing at the edge of the now quiet infirmary, watching soldiers who had nearly died sit up and ask for food with the particular hunger of men returning to life. "You saved them," he said simply. "All of them." "We saved them," Alara corrected, glancing toward him. "You boiled a great deal of water, Your Grace." A rare, genuine smile broke across his face, unguarded and startlingly warm, and for a moment, Alara forgot entirely that she was standing in front of a king who had promised his entire kingdom he would never let himself feel anything close to what was building steadily between them. She did not know about the vow yet. She only knew that something had shifted, quietly and completely, over 3 sleepless nights spent fighting sickness together, and that whatever it was, it felt far too strong to be explained away by exhaustion or gratitude alone. Neither of them spoke of it. Neither of them was ready to. But as Cale turned to leave the infirmary that morning, he paused at the door and glanced back at her one last time, and the look on his face was not the look of a king dismissing a healer he barely knew. It was the look of a man losing a battle he had sworn, years ago, that he would never fight at all. A goblet shattered against the council chamber wall, and every noble in the room fell silent. "The king spends his evenings in the infirmary courtyard with a rogue healer," Lord Callan Draven said, his voice smooth despite the fury simmering beneath it. "He cancelled 2 trade negotiations this week alone, to be present when she treats patients who no longer require his presence. Tell me, Council, does this sound like the behavior of a ruler in control of himself?" Murmurs rippled through the gathered nobles seated around the long stone table. Cale sat at the head of it, his expression carefully blank, though his hands had curled into fists beneath the table where no one could see. "I visit the infirmary to check on my soldiers," Cale said evenly. "Finn Bracken nearly died. I would think my concern for my own second-in-command would not require explanation." "Your concern for your second-in-command does not require you to sit alone with the healer in the courtyard past midnight," Draven countered smoothly, and Cale's jaw tightened at how quickly the information had reached him. Someone in the palace was watching, reporting, feeding Draven every detail. "Forgive me, Your Grace, but the entire court remembers your father's reign. We remember what happens to a kingdom when its king becomes distracted by matters of the heart rather than matters of state." The comparison landed exactly where Draven intended it to, striking at the deepest fear Cale carried, and the room fell into an uncomfortable silence, as every noble present recalled the chaos of the previous king's final years. "I have made no vow to any woman," Cale said, his voice sharper now, edged with warning. "I suggest you choose your next words carefully, Lord Draven." Draven inclined his head in a show of deference that did not reach his eyes. "Of course, Your Grace. I only speak out of loyalty to the crown." But as the council session ended and the nobles filed out, Draven lingered behind, watching Cale with a calculating expression that promised this conversation was far from finished. Cale left the chamber with a headache building behind his eyes, frustrated by how easily Draven had turned a moment of simple gratitude into a political weapon. He knew the ambitious lord had wanted greater influence over the throne for years, ever since Cale's coronation had passed him over for a council seat he believed he deserved. Draven did not care about tradition, or the mate bond, or the memory of the previous king's failures. He cared about opportunity, and he had just found one wrapped neatly around a rogue healer's name. That evening, Cale summoned Finn to his private study, needing the counsel of the one person in the palace who had never once used their friendship for political gain. "Draven is building a case against me," Cale said, pacing before the fireplace. "He wants the council to believe I am repeating my father's mistakes." Finn, still recovering his full strength but stubborn enough to have resumed his duties early, settled into a chair with a knowing look. "Are you?" Cale stopped pacing. "What kind of question is that?" "The kind a friend asks when he watched his king spend 3 nights boiling water for a healer he claims means nothing to him," Finn said simply. "I am not blind, Cale. Whatever is happening between you and Alara Voss, it is happening whether you admit it or not. The question is whether you let Draven control the narrative, or whether you decide what it means for yourself. Chaol turned back toward the fire, his reflection flickering in the dark window beyond it. She is my mate, he admitted quietly, the words escaping him for the first time since that morning in the clearing. I knew the moment I caught her scent. Finn did not look surprised. He simply nodded slowly, as though a suspicion had finally been confirmed. And you intend to keep your vow? I intend to protect this kingdom, Chaol said, though the words felt hollow, even as he spoke them. I will not become my father. I will not let a bond dictate every decision I make, until my counsel becomes an afterthought, and my duties collect dust, while I chase after a feeling. Your father lost himself in obsession, Finn said carefully. That is not the same as a bond, Chaol. You have spent your entire reign so terrified of becoming him, that you have forgotten there might be another way to hold both a crown and a heart. Chaol did not answer. He simply stared into the fire, and Finn, recognizing the stubbornness of a man not yet ready to hear the truth, rose and left him alone with his thoughts. Meanwhile, at the southern wall, Elara had begun noticing small changes she could not explain. Colors seemed sharper. Sounds carried further than they should. Once, walking through the market near the wall, she had caught the faint scent of pine and rain on the wind, and felt her pulse quicken before she even understood why, only realizing afterward that the scent reminded her, inexplicably, of the king. She mentioned it to Mira one evening, sitting by the fire in the small house they shared with 3 other members of their clan. It sounds like a bond forming, Mira said carefully, watching Elara's reaction closely. A bond, Elara repeated, frowning. Like a mate bond? That is impossible. I am a rogue healer. He is the Alpha King. Fate does not work that way. Fate rarely asks permission, Mira said. I have seen it before, child. The pull, the sharpened senses, the way your body seems to know where he is without being told. If this is truly happening, you deserve to understand what it means before it consumes you without warning. Elara sat in silence for a long moment, turning the possibility over in her mind, both terrified and, to her own surprise, quietly hopeful. She thought of the way Chaol had looked at her in the infirmary courtyard, the unguarded warmth in his eyes, before he caught himself and retreated behind his crown once more. She thought of the pull in her chest that had never once stopped since the day of the ambush. If it is a bond, she said slowly, why has he said nothing? Mira's expression softened with something like sympathy. Because kings are taught to fear what the rest of us are taught to hope for. The following week, Draven's influence began to show itself in smaller, crueler ways. Supplies meant for the southern wall arrived late and short in quantity. A request Mira had submitted for additional housing materials was quietly denied by a council clerk loyal to Draven's faction. Rumors began circulating through the palace and the border settlements alike. Whispers that the rogue clan had brought sickness across the border deliberately, that their healer had bewitched the king with dark rogue magic to weaken his judgment. Elara heard the rumors secondhand from a nervous young guard who delivered a message from the palace, requesting her presence for a routine health inspection of the settlement. An inspection that had never been required before. They are trying to push us out, Mira said grimly, reading the tension in the guard's apologetic delivery. Someone in that palace wants us gone, and they are using fear to do it. Elara felt anger rise in her chest, sharp and protective. Her people had survived a burned village, a desperate flight across dangerous territory, and an ambush that nearly cost them everything, only to now face quiet persecution dressed up as bureaucratic procedure. She decided, against every instinct telling her to stay away from the palace and the complicated feelings it stirred in her, that she needed to speak with the king directly. She arrived at the palace gates the following afternoon, insisting to the guards that her business was urgent, and was eventually escorted to a private courtyard where Chaol was reviewing reports with visible exhaustion etched into his features. He looked up when she entered, and something in his expression shifted instantly from weary distraction to sharp, careful attention. Elara, he said, rising from his seat, what is wrong? Someone in your court is trying to destroy my people, she said, not bothering with formalities. Supplies delayed, requests denied, rumors spreading that we brought sickness and dark magic into your kingdom. I want to know if these are your orders, your grace, or if you are as unaware as you seem. Chaol's expression darkened, and Alara watched fury replace exhaustion in his eyes, a fury that was not directed at her. "These are not my orders," he said, his voice tight with restrained anger. "I will find whoever is responsible, and I will end it." "Will you?" Alara challenged, stepping closer despite every instinct warning her to keep distance between them. "Or will you retreat behind your crown, the way you retreated from me after the infirmary, pretending nothing happened between us while your council quietly tears my people apart?" The accusation struck deeper than she intended, and for a moment, the careful mask Chaol wore in front of his court slipped entirely, revealing something raw and conflicted beneath it. "You do not understand what is at stake," he said quietly. "Then explain it to me," Alara said, refusing to back down. "Because I am tired of feeling something I cannot name, watched by a king who looks at me like I matter, and then disappears the moment it becomes inconvenient." Chaol stared at her, torn between the vow he had sworn before his entire kingdom, and the truth pressing desperately against his chest, demanding to be spoken. The distance between them had narrowed without either of them noticing, close enough now that Alara could feel the warmth radiating from him, could see the storm gathering behind his stormy gray eyes. "Alara," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "there is something I have not told you." Before he could continue, a guard burst into the courtyard, breathless and urgent, interrupting the moment with news that would change everything that followed.
"Your Grace, forgive the intrusion, but there has been an incident at the southern wall, an attack."
Both Chaol and Alara turned sharply toward the guard, the unfinished confession hanging forgotten in the air between them, replaced instantly by fear for the people they had both, in their own ways, sworn to protect. Smoke curled above the southern wall by the time Chaol and Alara arrived, riding hard through the dark forest, with a small unit of soldiers close behind them. Alara's heart pounded with a fear sharper than anything she had felt since the ambush that first brought her into Chaol's kingdom, and beside her, Chaol's expression had turned to stone, the careful control of a king, replacing the vulnerable man who had almost confessed something in the courtyard only an hour before. They found the settlement in disarray but, thankfully, mostly intact. A storage shed had been set ablaze, and 2 guards posted at the wall had been struck unconscious, but no lives had been lost. Mira met them at the edge of the settlement, her expression grim. "Rogue attackers, 3 of them, wearing no crest," she reported. "They set fire to our grain stores and fled before we could catch them. This was not a raid for supplies, Your Grace. This was a message." Chaol's jaw tightened as he surveyed the damage. "A message meant to frighten your people into leaving my kingdom. Or meant to make it look as though we cannot be trusted to remain here safely," Alara added quietly, understanding settling over her like a cold weight. "Giving your council another reason to demand we be sent away." Chaol turned to his captain, ordering a full investigation and additional guards to be stationed permanently at the southern wall, but Alara could see the frustration simmering beneath his composed exterior, the same fury she had witnessed in the courtyard, now sharpened by fear for people who had become, however reluctantly, under his protection. That night, after the fires were extinguished and the frightened settlement finally quieted into uneasy sleep, Chaol found Alara sitting alone near the damaged storage shed, staring at the scorched wood with tired, troubled eyes. "You should be resting," he said, settling beside her without waiting for permission, close enough now that their earlier conversation felt suspended in the air between them, waiting to be finished. "So should you," she replied, echoing words she had spoken to him once before, in another courtyard, in what felt like a different lifetime. Chaol let out a quiet, humorless laugh. "It seems neither of us is very good at following that advice." They sat in silence for a long moment, the only sound the distant crackle of embers still cooling in the burned shed. Alara finally turned to look at him, studying the tension in his shoulders, the shadows beneath his eyes. "You were about to tell me something, before the guard interrupted," she said quietly. "I would still like to hear it." Chaol was silent for a long moment, staring at the dying embers, as though searching for the courage he needed within the fading light. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and unsteady, in a way Alara had never heard from him before. "When I found you in that clearing, the day of the ambush," he began, "I recognized your scent instantly. Wildflowers and rain. My wolf reacted before I even understood what was happening." He paused, gathering himself. "Alara, you are my mate." The words landed with a quiet seismic force, and Alara felt the truth of them settle into place like the final piece of a puzzle she had been assembling without realizing it. Every strange pull, every sharpened sense, every unexplainable ache in her chest, suddenly making perfect, undeniable sense. "I knew," she whispered. "Some part of me knew, from the very first day. I just did not have the word for it." "I made a vow," Cale continued, his voice rough with old grief and older fear. "The night I took the throne, I swore before my entire kingdom that I would never touch a mate, should the goddess ever curse me with one. My father lost himself in his bond. He let this kingdom nearly burn because he could not separate his duty from his obsession, and I promised myself, I promised my people, that I would never let that happen again." Alara absorbed his words carefully, understanding now the source of every retreat, every careful distance he had placed between them since that first meeting. "And you believe loving me would destroy you the way it destroyed him." "I believe I cannot risk finding out," Cale said quietly. "This kingdom has already survived one king who lost himself to a bond. It cannot survive another." "That is not fair," Alara said, anger flaring quietly beneath her words, though it was not directed at him so much as at the fear that had trapped him for so long. "You are punishing yourself for a choice your father made, as though love itself is the enemy, rather than the way he handled it. A bond is not a weakness, Cale. It only becomes one if you let it consume everything else you are." "How would you know?" Cale asked, though there was no real challenge in the question, only genuine, aching curiosity. "Because I have spent my entire life caring for people," Alara said, "healing them, holding them together when they are breaking apart. Love, real love, does not destroy people. Fear does, obsession does, but love, when it is balanced with everything else that matters, only makes people stronger." She turned to face him fully, her eyes steady despite the vulnerability trembling beneath her voice. "You are not your father, Cale. You never had to be." Cale stared at her for a long moment, something shifting behind his stormy eyes, years of careful, guarded control beginning, ever so slightly, to crack. He reached out, hesitant, and gently brushed a strand of hair from her face, his fingers lingering against her cheek longer than necessary. "I am terrified," he admitted quietly, the confession costing him more than any battle he had ever fought. "So am I," Alara whispered, "but I would rather be terrified with you than safe without you." For a long, suspended moment, neither of them moved, the space between them thick with everything they had both been holding back since that first fateful meeting in the clearing. Then Cale, slowly, carefully, as though giving her every opportunity to pull away, leaned forward, and Alara did not pull away at all. His lips met hers, soft and hesitant at first, and then deepening, as the vow he had carried for years finally shattered beneath the weight of everything he had been trying so desperately to deny. Alara kissed him back without hesitation, her hands finding the front of his shirt, pulling him closer, as the pull that had haunted her for weeks finally, gloriously, found its answer. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Cale pressed his forehead against hers, his eyes closed, his heart pounding loud enough that Alara could feel it beneath her palm. "That changes everything," he murmured. "I know," Alara whispered back, a small, trembling smile touching her lips, despite the uncertainty of everything still ahead of them. "But some things are worth changing for." Neither of them noticed the figure watching from the shadows near the settlement's edge, a spy loyal to Lord Draven, already turning back toward the palace, with news that would soon set the entire court ablaze, far more dangerously than any fire the southern wall had survived that night. Morning light spilled through the tall windows of the council chamber, but the warmth of it did nothing to soften the chill that had settled over Cale since he arrived. He had barely slept, his mind replaying the memory of Alara's lips against his own, the way the bond had settled into place like a missing piece finally restored, when Finn arrived at his study with news that turned that warmth to ice. "Draven knows," Finn said without preamble, closing the door firmly behind him. "Someone saw you at the southern wall last night. It is already spreading through the court." Cale's stomach dropped. "How?" "A spy. Most likely one of Draven's people planted among the settlement guards," Finn said grimly. "He is calling for an emergency council session this afternoon. He intends to use this against you, Cale. Publicly." Cale closed his eyes briefly, the reality of the situation settling over him with crushing weight. He had broken his vow in a moment of vulnerability he did not regret, not for a single second, but he had not accounted for how quickly that private moment would be turned into political ammunition. The council chamber was tense with anticipation when Chaol arrived that afternoon, every noble seated and watching him, with expressions ranging from curiosity to open suspicion. Draven stood at the center of the room, clearly relishing the moment he had been waiting for. "It has come to my attention," Draven began, his voice carrying easily through the silent chamber, "that our king was seen last night, engaged in an intimate embrace with the rogue healer Alara Voss, a woman whose people, need I remind this council, arrived in our kingdom as refugees fleeing conflict, and who have already been the subject of concern regarding their loyalty and influence." Murmurs rippled through the gathered nobles, and Chaol felt Ilara's absence from the room acutely, wishing she were beside him, even as he understood exactly why Draven had ensured she was not invited to defend herself. "I do not deny it," Chaol said, his voice steady despite the storm building within him. "Alara Voss is my mate. I discovered this the day her clan crossed our border, and I have spent every day since trying to deny it, out of respect for the vow I made before this very council." "A vow you have now broken," Draven said smoothly, seizing the admission. "Tell me, Your Grace, how does the council trust a king who cannot keep his word to his own people? If you will abandon a vow made before the entire court for the sake of a rogue healer's affections, what else might you abandon when it becomes convenient?" "This is not the same as my father's failure," Chaol said, anger sharpening his words now. "I have not neglected my duties. I have not let this bond control my decisions." "Not yet," Draven countered, "but bonds have a way of deepening, Your Grace, of consuming even the strongest-willed among us. Your own father believed himself in control too, once." The comparison struck exactly where it was meant to, and Chaol watched several council members exchange uneasy glances, old fears resurfacing despite the years of stability he had worked so hard to build. He opened his mouth to argue further, but Draven was not finished. "I propose a formal inquiry into the rogue clan's presence within our borders," Draven continued, turning to address the wider council now. "Given the king's compromised judgment regarding this particular healer, I believe it falls to this council to determine whether the clan poses a genuine risk to the stability of the crown." The proposal landed like a blade, and Chaol understood instantly what Draven was truly attempting, not merely to embarrass him, but to seize the opportunity to have Alara's people investigated, discredited, and ultimately removed from the kingdom entirely, weakening Chaol's position and strengthening Draven's own influence over a rattled and fearful council. The vote was called before Chaol could fully organize his response, and to his growing horror, enough council members, swayed by old fears and Draven's careful manipulation, voted in favor of the inquiry. That evening, Chaol sought out Alara at the southern wall, finding her in the small house she shared with Mira and the others, already aware of what had happened through whispers that had traveled faster than he could reach her. "They are going to investigate my people," she said the moment he entered, her voice tight with barely controlled fear. "Because of us. Because of what happened between us. I will not let Draven use this to hurt your clan," Chaol said firmly, though even as he spoke the words, he heard the uncertainty beneath them, the awareness that his influence, once absolute, had just been meaningfully weakened by his own counsel. "You cannot promise that," Alara said, and there was no accusation in her voice, only exhausted honesty. "You said it yourself, Chaol. Bonds have consequences. I did not understand, until today, how real those consequences could be for people who have already lost everything once." Chaol crossed the room and took her hands in his gray eyes searching hers with a desperation that had nothing to do with kingship, and everything to do with the fear of losing the one thing that had finally made him feel whole. "I do not regret what happened between us," he said quietly, "not for a single moment. But I understand now that this fight is no longer only mine, it belongs to both of us, and to your people as well." "Then we fight it together," Alara said, her voice steadying with quiet resolve despite the fear still lingering in her eyes. "Not as a king protecting a healer, and not as a rogue hiding behind a crown, but as equals." Chaol pressed his forehead against hers, breathing in the scent of wildflowers and rain that had haunted him since the very first day, and for the first time since his father's chaotic reign had taught him to fear this exact kind of bond, he allowed himself to believe that perhaps love and duty were not natural enemies after all, but two forces that, handled with enough courage, could stand together against anything Draven's ambition might throw at them. Neither of them yet understood how far Draven was willing to go to ensure that belief never had the chance to prove itself true. The inquiry began 3 days later, conducted by a panel of council members handpicked by Draven himself, and it did not take long for Elara to understand that fairness had never been part of the plan. Members of her clan were questioned for hours about their movements before crossing the border, their reasons for fleeing the Eastern Territories, their loyalty to the Ashworth crown. Innocent details were twisted into suspicion. A young man named Rowan, who had once traded goods with an Eastern merchant during better times, was accused of maintaining secret ties to hostile pacts. An elderly woman who kept traditional rogue remedies was accused of practicing forbidden magic. Every answer, no matter how honest, seemed to feed a narrative that had already been written long before the questioning began. Elara herself was called before the panel on the 4th day, and she stood before them with her chin lifted, refusing to let fear show despite the way Draven watched her with barely concealed satisfaction. "Tell the council," Draven said, his voice deceptively pleasant, "how you came to gain such swift and significant influence over the king's decisions." "I have no influence over the king's decisions," Elara replied evenly. "I am a healer. I treated sick soldiers because it was the right thing to do, and it saved lives, including the life of his second-in-command. And yet the king broke a vow made before this entire court, a vow meant to protect this kingdom from the very instability his own father caused," Draven pressed. "Would you not agree that such influence, whether intended or not, poses a risk this council cannot ignore?" "I would agree that fear poses a far greater risk than love ever has," Elara said, her voice steady despite the danger of speaking so boldly before a hostile panel. "My people fled a burning village. We arrived here starving and desperate, and instead of the shelter we were promised, we have been met with suspicion, sabotage, and now an inquiry built entirely on rumor and ambition rather than truth." A murmur rippled through the panel, and Draven's expression flickered, briefly, with something like irritation, before he smoothed it back into practiced calm. "Bold words for a rogue outsider," he said quietly. "Bold words for someone who has done nothing wrong," Elara countered. The inquiry continued for 2 more agonizing days, and though no concrete evidence of wrongdoing was ever produced, Draven had achieved exactly what he intended, planting seeds of doubt deep enough within the council that even Kael's staunchest allies began to hesitate, uncertain how to navigate a situation that had grown far more complicated than a simple matter of the heart. On the 6th night, Draven made his final move. Under the guise of a routine border patrol, soldiers loyal to Draven's faction arrived at the southern wall after dark, claiming to have received evidence of a security breach, requiring immediate arrests. Before Mira or the settlement guards could properly resist, Elara was taken into custody, along with several other members of her clan, and transported to a holding cell within the palace, under formal charges of endangering the security of the crown. Word reached Kael within the hour, delivered by a frantic Finn who burst into his study with barely contained fury. "Draven has arrested Elara," Finn said. "He is calling it a precautionary measure while the inquiry concludes. But Kael, this is a trap. He wants you to react. He wants you to choose between your duty as king and your bond as her mate, in front of the entire court. Because whichever choice you make, he believes it destroys you." Kael felt something cold and furious settle over him, a clarity sharper than anything he had experienced since taking the throne. He understood now, with painful precision, exactly what Draven had been building toward from the very first council session. If Kael abandoned Elara to protect his image as a controlled, dutiful king, he would prove himself weak and cowardly in the eyes of anyone who valued loyalty, a king unwilling to protect the person fate had chosen for him. But if he stormed to her defense, breaking protocol and openly prioritizing the bond over council procedure, Draven would use it as final proof that Kael had become exactly what he had sworn never to become, a ruler consumed by his mate at the expense of his kingdom. Either path, carefully constructed, led toward the same destination Draven desired most, Kael's removal from a throne he no longer appeared fit to hold. "He has cornered me," Kael said quietly, staring at the fire in his study without truly seeing it. "Then stop thinking like a man cornered," Finn said firmly. "Think like a king who understands something Draven never will. Strength is not the absence of love, Kael. It never has been. Your father's failure was not that he loved his mate, it was that he let obsession replace every other part of who he was. You have never done that, not once, not even now. Prove it, not by choosing between duty and love, but by showing this entire court that a king can hold both without breaking. Cale turned to look at his oldest friend, something settling into place behind his stormy eyes, a resolve forged not from fear this time, but from clarity. Gather the council, he said, all of them, tonight. Cale, it is nearly midnight. Then Draven will simply have to be woken from his sleep, Cale said, a dangerous calm settling over his features as he moved toward the door. Because I am done letting him write the story of who I am. Tonight, I intend to write it myself. The council chamber filled slowly with bleary-eyed nobles pulled from their beds, murmuring amongst themselves in confusion, as Cale stood at the head of the room, fully dressed, fully composed, waiting with a patience that unsettled everyone who saw it. Draven arrived last, his expression carefully arranged into concern, though Cale did not miss the flicker of satisfaction beneath it. Your Grace, Draven said smoothly, this is an unusual hour for a council session. It is, Cale agreed, but I find I am done waiting for a more convenient time to correct a mistake I allowed to grow far too large. He turned to address the full council, his voice carrying easily through the tense silence of the chamber. 6 days ago, this council authorized an inquiry into the rogue clan currently sheltering at our southern wall, an inquiry built upon suspicion rather than evidence. Tonight, one of that clan's members, a woman who has done nothing but heal our sick and defend her people with honesty, even under hostile questioning, was arrested without proper process, under the pretense of a security breach that no one in this room has been shown a single shred of proof for. He let the words settle before continuing, his gaze finding Draven directly. I know exactly why this happened, Lord Draven. I know exactly what you hoped I would do. Either abandon her to preserve some illusion of control, or defend her recklessly, and hand you the very proof of weakness you have been searching for since the day you lost your seat on this council years ago. I am done playing the role you have written for me. Draven's composure flickered, genuine surprise breaking through his practiced calm for the first time. Alara Voss is my mate, Cale continued, his voice steady and unashamed. I discovered this the day her people crossed our border, and for months I denied it, hid it, buried it, beneath duty and fear, because I swore an oath born from watching my father destroy this kingdom through obsession. But I have learned something these past weeks that fear never allowed me to understand before. My father's failure was never the bond itself, it was that he let it consume every other part of who he was, until nothing remained but a man chasing a feeling while his people suffered. He stepped forward, addressing the entire chamber now with unwavering conviction. I have not neglected this kingdom. I have not abandoned my duties. I have led this council through trade disputes, border conflicts, and a sickness that nearly claimed my own second-in-command, all while carrying this bond quietly, out of respect for a vow I made in fear rather than wisdom. That fear ends tonight. I release Alara Voss immediately, and I formally withdraw the inquiry against her clan, an inquiry built entirely on manufactured suspicion, designed to serve one man's ambition, rather than this kingdom's genuine security. Gasps and murmurs spread through the chamber, and Draven, sensing the tide turning dangerously against him, attempted to regain control. Your Grace, this is precisely the reckless behavior I warned this council about. A king, ruled by sentiment rather than judgment. Careful, Lord Draven, Cale said, his voice dropping into something colder and far more dangerous. I have spent this past week reviewing the records of the guards who arrested Alara tonight. Guards who report directly to your household, dispatched under orders that bypassed proper council authorization entirely. I have also reviewed reports of delayed supplies, denied requests, and a suspicious fire at the southern wall, all originating from decisions made by clerks and officers loyal specifically to your faction. Draven's face paled slightly, though he attempted to maintain his composure. Coincidence, Your Grace, nothing more. Perhaps, Cale said, or perhaps a formal investigation into your own conduct, conducted with the same scrutiny you demanded be applied to a starving clan of refugees, will reveal something far less coincidental. The chamber erupted into hushed, urgent conversation, council members exchanging alarmed glances as the true shape of Draven's manipulation began to reveal itself before them. Cale raised a hand, silencing the room once more. "I am not asking this council to simply trust my word," he said. "I am asking for a full and transparent investigation into Lord Draven's actions these past weeks, conducted by an impartial panel, alongside the immediate and unconditional release of Alara Voss and every member of her clan currently held without proper cause." A vote was called, and this time, freed from the fear and manipulation that had clouded the previous session, the council sided overwhelmingly with their king. Draven, recognizing the shifting tide too late to salvage his position, was escorted from the chamber under guard, his protests falling on ears no longer willing to listen. Cale did not wait for the formalities to conclude. The moment the vote was finalized, he strode from the chamber directly toward the holding cells, Finn close behind him, his heart pounding with an urgency that had nothing to do with politics, and everything to do with the woman waiting there, uncertain whether the man she loved would choose her, or the crown he had spent his entire life protecting. He found her sitting on a narrow bench within a small stone cell, her expression carefully composed, despite the fear he could see lingering beneath it. The moment she saw him, she rose to her feet, searching his face for answers. "It is over," Cale said, his voice thick with emotion as the guard hurried to unlock the cell door. "The inquiry is withdrawn. You are free. Your people are free." Relief flooded her features, quickly followed by uncertainty. "And Draven?" "Exposed," Cale said, "and under investigation for actions that go far beyond a simple political rivalry." Alara stepped out of the cell, and for a moment, they simply stood there, close enough to touch, but not quite closing the distance. Months of fear and hesitation, finally giving way to a quiet, trembling relief. "You chose," she whispered. "I did not choose between duty and you," Cale said gently, reaching out to cup her face in his hands. "I chose to stop believing they were opposites in the first place. I am done hiding what you mean to me, Alara. Not from my council, not from my kingdom, and not from myself." Alara closed the remaining distance between them, and this time, when their lips met, there was no hesitation left in either of them, only the quiet, certain relief of two people who had finally stopped fighting the very thing fate had given them. The investigation into Lord Draven's conduct concluded 3 weeks later, and the findings confirmed everything Cale had suspected and more. Records showed a clear pattern of sabotage against the Southern Wall settlement, deliberately delayed supplies, falsified reports meant to paint the rogue clan as a security threat, and, most damning of all, a trail of payments connecting Draven directly to the mercenaries responsible for the fire that had nearly destroyed the settlement's grain stores weeks earlier. Draven was stripped of his council seat and his noble title, exiled from the Ashworth Kingdom, under strict terms that forbade his return. A fall from power swift and complete enough that even his few remaining allies within the court did not dare speak in his defense. Cale watched him escorted from the palace grounds for the final time, with a quiet, settled sense of closure. Not triumph exactly, but the relief of a threat finally, fully removed. With Draven gone, the council's attention turned toward rebuilding what his manipulation had damaged. The Southern Wall settlement received the resources it had been denied for weeks: proper housing materials, medical supplies, and formal recognition of the rogue clan's right to remain within Ashworth borders, not as refugees dependent on the crown's charity, but as citizens with the same protections afforded to every other pack within the kingdom. Alara threw herself into the work of rebuilding, alongside her people, her days filled with construction, healing, and the steady work of restoring a sense of safety that had been so cruelly disrupted. But even amid the busy rhythm of rebuilding, she found herself drawn back to the palace more and more often, no longer summoned in secret or hidden away at the edges of the court, but welcomed openly, walking the palace halls beside Cale, as though she had always belonged there. The court, once suspicious of her presence, slowly began to warm toward her as word spread of her role in saving Finn Bracken and countless other soldiers during the Moonrot outbreak, and as they watched, day after day, the way Cale's leadership only grew steadier and more decisive with her beside him rather than weaker, exactly the opposite of what Draven had spent months trying to convince them would happen. One evening, several weeks after Draven's exile, Cale found Alara in the palace gardens, tending carefully to a small patch of silverleaf she had planted herself, insisting the infirmary needed its own steady supply, rather than relying entirely on trade from outside territories. "You have made yourself quite at home here," he said, settling onto the stone bench beside her garden bed, watching her work with the same quiet fascination he always felt in her presence. Someone has to make sure your infirmary does not fall into chaos the next time sickness strikes, Ilara replied, brushing dirt from her hands as she sat back on her heels to look at him. Besides, I have grown rather fond of this kingdom. Strange, considering how it nearly took my head the day I arrived. Kale laughed softly, the sound easy and unguarded in a way it had rarely been before Ilara entered his life. I seem to recall apologizing for that. You did, Ilara said, smiling. Eventually, after several sleepless nights and one very memorable kiss. Kale's expression softened, and he reached for her hand, turning serious despite the teasing warmth still lingering between them. Ilara, these past months have taught me something I spent years refusing to believe. My father's failure was never that he loved too deeply. It was that he never learned how to hold love and duty together, how to let one strengthen the other, instead of forcing himself to choose. You have taught me how to hold both. He reached into his coat and produced a small, simple pendant, carved from silver in the shape of a wolf beneath a full moon, the traditional symbol of a formal mate claiming among Ashworth royalty. I know we have already been through so much, and I know a title changes very little about what already exists between us, he said, his voice steady, despite the vulnerability shining plainly in his eyes. But I want the entire kingdom to know, without any doubt, without any hiding, that you are my mate, my equal, and, if you will allow it, my queen. Ilara stared at the pendant, then at the man holding it, months of fear, uncertainty, and quiet longing, finally settling into something steady and whole. I thought you would never ask, she said softly, her eyes bright with unshed tears as she allowed him to fasten the pendant gently around her neck. Word of the formal claiming spread through the kingdom within days, and rather than the scandal Draven had once predicted, the news was met with genuine celebration. The Rogue clan, once viewed with suspicion, was now embraced as part of the very fabric of the kingdom, their healer set to become queen, a living symbol of unity between two peoples who had once stood divided by fear and old prejudice. Preparations began almost immediately for a formal coronation ceremony, one unlike anything the Ashworth kingdom had seen before, a joining not just of two hearts, but of two communities finally choosing understanding over suspicion, connection over the old walls fear had built between them. The morning of the ceremony arrived bright and clear, the kind of sky that seemed to promise something lasting. The palace grounds had been transformed, silver banners bearing the Ashworth crest, hanging alongside simpler woven banners crafted by hand from the southern wall settlement, a deliberate symbol, chosen by Kale himself, to honor both halves of the union about to take place. Ilara stood in a small chamber overlooking the gardens, dressed in a gown of pale silver that caught the morning light, while Mira fastened the final clasp at her back, with hands that trembled slightly despite her usual steady composure. I never imagined this, Mira admitted quietly, meeting Ilara's eyes in the mirror. The day we crossed that border, starving and desperate, I thought we were walking toward our end, not toward this. Neither did I, Ilara said softly, reaching back to squeeze Mira's hand. But perhaps that is how the best things arrive, unexpected, uninvited, and impossible to predict. Outside, the palace courtyard filled with nobles, soldiers, and members of the Rogue clan alike, standing together for the first time, not as separate groups eyeing each other with suspicion, but as guests gathered for the same celebration. Finn Bracken stood near the front, fully recovered from the fever that had first brought Ilara into the palace, watching the preparations with a proud, knowing smile. When Ilara finally stepped into the courtyard, the assembled crowd fell into a hush of quiet awe, and Kale, standing at the front beside the kingdom's eldest priestess, felt his breath catch entirely at the sight of her, the woman who had walked into his life, bound and threatened, and walked out of it as the person who had taught him what real strength actually meant. The ceremony itself was simple, rooted in old Ashworth tradition, a joining of hands, an exchange of vows, spoken not in the careful, guarded language of politics, but in plain, honest words, chosen by two people who had already survived far greater tests than any ceremony could pose. I vow to stand beside you, Kale said, his voice steady and clear across the silent courtyard, not as a king ruling alone, but as a partner who has learned that strength shared is stronger than strength hidden. I vow to protect this kingdom, with both my mind and my heart, no longer forcing myself to choose between them. I vow to heal what needs healing, Ilara replied, her voice carrying the same quiet steadiness that had first drawn every soldier in the infirmary to trust her without question. Not only the wounds of the body, but the old fears that once divided our peoples. I vow to stand beside you as an equal, not in spite of where I come from, but because of it. The priestess pronounced them bonded before the kingdom, and as Kale leaned in to seal the vow with a kiss, the courtyard erupted into cheers, loud enough to carry across the palace grounds and beyond, out toward the southern wall, where the rest of the settlement had gathered, to celebrate the moment their healer became something far greater than any of them had once dared to imagine. In the months that followed, the kingdom settled into a peace, steadier than any it had known in years. The old suspicion between the rogue clans and the royal court faded gradually into genuine partnership, the southern wall settlement growing into a thriving village, rather than a temporary shelter, its people no longer viewed as refugees, but as respected citizens, whose healer now sat beside the throne itself. Kale ruled with a steadiness that silenced even the last remaining doubts about his father's legacy, his decisions sharper and more compassionate than ever, guided not by fear of repeating old mistakes, but by the quiet confidence of a man who had finally learned to hold both duty and love without losing himself to either. Ilara continued her work in the infirmary, training new healers, expanding the Silverleaf Gardens, and serving as a bridge between two communities that had once stood on opposite sides of a border neither had chosen. Some evenings, when the palace grew quiet and the day's duties finally settled, Kale and Ilara would walk together through the same gardens where he had first given her the silver pendant, no longer a king and a rogue healer separated by fear and old vows, but simply two people who had found, against every expectation, that the bond fate had chosen for them was never a weakness at all. It had been, from the very beginning, exactly the strength the kingdom needed. And as the seasons turned and the kingdom continued to flourish under their shared rule, the story of the Alpha King who once swore he would never touch his mate became something else entirely within the Ashworth court. No longer a warning whispered among nervous nobles, but a promise passed down through generations, that love, when finally allowed to stand beside duty rather than against it, could build something no vow of fear ever could.